it's like stealthily the most dog positive franchise in a world where we have Dog's Purpose, A Dog's Journey, A Dog's Way Home, and all these dog movies.
Welcome to the Crooked Table Podcast, where we discuss the world of film from a fresh angle. And now your host, Robert Yanis Jr.
Welcome to the Crooked Table Podcast. This is Rob. On this show, we democratize the film criticism conversation by bringing on fans and critics alike to talk about film that they really connect to, or something. It could be something they grew up with, or just something that they really, really love and just are very passionate in wanting to talk about. So this episode is a little bit different because while we are focusing on a particular film, we're really also expanding, much like the film itself, into a larger universe and into the franchise that's really come of it. So this episode, I'm joined by John Cohorn. Welcome to the Crooked Table Podcast.
Thank you, Rob. I'm happy to be here.
So can you tell listeners a little bit about who you are, what you have going on, and where they can find you online?
Absolutely. Like you said, my name is John Cohorn. I am based out of Austin, Texas, and I am writing for modernhorrors.com. I am a huge and long time just horror nut. So it's a little bit off brand to be talking about action movies like we're going to today, but this is one of the exceptions. One of the first jobs I had when I was a teenager was working in a movie theater, and I spent time as a projectionist and spent time managing theaters. And then when I was in college later, I worked in a video store during the heyday of video stores. So movies have always kind of been in my blood. So it's a joy to be able to write for Modern Horrors and to join people like you doing movie podcasting and talk about this thing that's in my blood.
That's funny, too, because my first job was actually working at an AMC. Actually, the same one I go to frequently still, down this, like 10 minutes from my house here in Tampa, Florida. So I go there. So I've seen, I worked there in the early 2000s, so like 2001 to 2003. So I've seen that theater evolve over the years. And, I remember all of that stuff, running into a video store, and just looking at all the boxes. And I usually went straight to the horror section, which is funny because while the imagery on those was really usually very freaky, especially like a 10-year-old kid at the time, I've never really been able to be getting like full bore into horror because I don't know, I'm still, I think, a little skittish with certain elements. So like things with cannibalism, like for example, I'm like not so good with. Is there a particular type, like subgenre within horror? Because that's such a broad term these days.
Well, so what got me started down the horror path very early, I went to a birthday party sleepover when I was in probably second grade. And my parents at the time were pretty conservative and didn't really let my sister and I watch a whole lot of things unless they had approved it first. But this particular birthday party, the kid's mom had rented VHS copies of George Romero's Night of the Living Dead and Creepshow and showed them to us back to back. And I couldn't sleep right for weeks afterwards, but it changed my life. And so I've got a soft spot for Romero. Some of his movies definitely fall into kind of the B movie category, but when he hits it right, there's just something special about it. I mean, to this day, my favorite movie, not just my favorite horror movie, is Dawn of the Dead. And so Romero is definitely high up on the list. From there, I branched out into Italian horror. So probably a lot of things that you really wouldn't enjoy, zombies and cannibals and pretty much anything weird. And John Carpenter's another one that's always high on the list.
Naturally.
So I just have a voracious appetite for cinema. But when family members or friends ask me to bring over a movie or something, I start looking at my shelves, and probably 90 to 95% of it is horror or exploitation. So I don't really have a whole lot that I can like take over to my folks' house if we're all hanging out over the holidays or something like that.
Right. Is there, just out of curiosity, is there a particular horror movie that you've seen recently, like either something released this year or something that you just recently got a chance to go back and check out that you would recommend to people listening?
Oh man. Well, I actually have had the opportunity to see some really good ones this year, and probably I would say two of them that really surprised me were a film called I Trapped the Devil, directed by Josh Lobo. That was picked up by IFC Midnight. I think now it is on VOD. I don't know if it has been dated for a Blu-ray release, but I loved that film. It's got A.J. Bowen in it, and it's very much what it sounds. This guy comes home to visit his brother who has had some mental and emotional issues, and comes to find out that he has got someone trapped in his basement who he believes to be the devil. And it's this really kind of dark and intimate, almost like a character study mixed with an episode of The Twilight Zone. But it really, really hit all the sweet spots for me. And then there was a movie that I reviewed out of Tribeca this year called Something Else that really blew me away. It's hard to nail it down. It blends a number of different genres into it. So it is, it's got drama and romantic comedy and a bit of a character study and creature feature. It stars Jeremy Gardner and Brea Grant, and just amazed me. Both of those movies, I think, on a 5-star scale, I rated either 4 or 4.5 stars. So those are probably the ones this year that immediately jump to mind. But I'm sure there are others that I'm forgetting. I have gotten pretty religious about keeping a Letterboxd account so that I can go back and check and remember what I viewed and what my initial take on it was.
It sounds like I Trapped the Devil has a little bit of I'm picking up a little bit of a Frailty vibe, sort of, from that.
It takes a different approach than Frailty, but there are definitely some thematic similarities there.
Yeah, I'm not nearly as storied in horror as you, and like I said, there are certain things that I'm like, okay, that sounds a little too far down the rabbit hole, or the gore hole, I guess, or whatever for me. But yeah, I do try and seek out. I just actually recently watched this is kind of random. The 2 Wolf Cop movies, because I was like, that sounds like something I have to see. And then there was oh man, I can't remember it now. There's a movie coming out. Is it I think it's a priest who's turns into a raptor or something?
Oh, the Velocipaster.
Yes, things like that sometimes are just so bizarre that I'm like, all right, I have to check this out. Or I think it was an Australian movie a few years ago called Housebound. That was a lot of fun. Things like that. I like to, every once in a while, I'll be like, yeah, sure, let's check this out.
Yes, and I actually, so that kind of sparked something in my brain. So I did not see it, but they screened the Velocipaster earlier this month at Texas Frightmare Weekend. It was, if I remember correctly, kind of a later screening, and I had something else going on. But I would be remiss if I did not mention another movie that screened at Texas Frightmare, which I saw that made a big impression on me. And that was called The Dead Center. It starts off with a man who is ostensibly dead waking up in a body bag. And the story grows from there. I don't want to say too much to give away the twists and turns to your listeners, because it's one of those movies that really pays off going in not knowing a whole lot about it. But it grows into something much, much bigger than what it starts out as, and it really impressed me. It is pretty bleak. So it's not what I would call a feel-good movie, but it is a movie that left me thinking about it for weeks after having seen it.
One more question around the horror aspect before we get to the movie that we want to talk about. But you see at least I see on film Twitter and wherever in the media, I see every time a horror movie comes out and is a hit, maybe you know where I'm going with this, you see the term elevated horror, which I don't even know what that means. What is your take on any time, it feels like certain film critics if a horror movie is critically acclaimed or financially successful, that it somehow it stands apart from or transcends the genre or something like that. How do you define horror, and what's your take on that whole, I guess, mini controversy within the horror community? Because I know people on Twitter that I follow, that other critics and things like that have very strong feelings about that.
Honestly, I think the whole thing is a little bit silly. I think that there are some people who just for whatever reason have a certain distaste for horror, because I think horror as a genre covers such a wide range of films and tones and styles and approaches that for me, it's like, horror is horror. It may be A horror, it may be B horror, it may be, shot on video, just gore trash. Mm-hmm. But for me, if something scares me or it makes me feel uneasy or, makes me kind of look into the shadows a little deeper to see what's going on, that's a horror movie. I think the term elevated horror is just kind of silly. I don't get mad about it. Like, I know it's really aggravated some of our peers.
Right.
But to me, it just seems kind of silly. On the other hand, if that's what a certain critic or a certain moviegoer needs to call it to make it okay for them to watch it, or even better, to enjoy it, I'm not going to complain too much about that either. I think getting more eyes on the genre is good both for the individual filmmakers and for the genre as a whole. And so if you have to do a little bit of mental gymnastics to get there, so be it. A lot of the things that I've seen over the last couple of years that I've really enjoyed would fall into that category that some people use of elevated horror. And I think we'll probably see more of that in the next few years. But overall, I think it's good for the genre. It's good for filmmakers, and it's good to get more people actually out there seeing these movies.
Yeah, I agree, because you see something like Us, which is the big horror movie this year that's made so much money and got all those good reviews, and it's almost, to me, it feels just like a marketing tactic, just like guilt-free snacking. It's like the cinematic equivalent of that. It's like, don't worry, it's actually good for you. It's right. You're not gonna, that kind of thing. So it's just, I just wanted to get your take on that, and it's interesting that you're a horror fan and that we're talking about this action series, because some of the moments in these films kind of get kind of graphic with the violence and have like a lot of suspense to them, actually. So I would almost argue that there are some minor elements of horror kind of infused into this film and this franchise.
I would agree with you, especially given some of the sequences in the most recent episode, John Wick 3 Parabellum. There is a sequence that immediately reminded me of Lucio Fulci, who has a tendency to include scenes of ocular damage in some of his films.
Yeah, that's all you had to say. I was like, yep, I know exactly what you're talking about. Because there were, in the first two movies, I think, and then after I say this, I guess we'll just introduce the trailer and then get going on this. In the first two movies, I even said this to my wife. She's like, how was the movie? And she is kind of skittish with extreme violence, things like that. So I was like, I don't know how you're going to deal with this, because she's a fan of the franchise as well. But in the first two, there's like a moment or two where I kind of go, ooh, that was a bad one. That was ugly. What just happened there? Right. The thing with the pencil, which we'll get into in the second one. But in the third one, it felt like it was like every 10 minutes. I was like, oh, damn. No, he did not. So obviously, we're going to be talking about John Wick in this episode. So let's listen to a little bit of the trailer right now.
Daisy.
I lost everything. That dog was a final gift from my dying wife.
Jonathan, you got out once. You dip so much as a pinky back into this pond, you may find something reaching out to pull you back in.
It's personal.
Where'd you get that car?
What does it matter?
It's not what you did, son. It's who you did it to.
Nobody?
That nobody is John Wick.
that was a little bit of the trailer for John Wick, directed by Chad Stahelski, and uncredited David Leitch. So he went off and did Deadpool 2 and Atomic Blonde, and he's doing Hobbs and Shaw, I think, this summer. So, yes. And Chad has stayed with the franchise, which we'll get into a little bit of that. So I guess to start with, we actually, this conversation came up kind of organically on Twitter because I saw Chapter 3 Parabellum and was just lavishing praise on it. And Dane Michael of CF3 was like, you guys need to talk. And so to start with, when did you come across this franchise, and what were your initial thoughts?
So I can't remember who recommended the first one to me. Otherwise, I would give them full credit here. I wasn't really tracking on it when it first came out, but maybe a week or two after it had been released, one of my friends said, you've got to go see this movie. And so I went and saw the first one in the theater and was just blown away. And then when the second one came out, a woman I was dating at the time, she and I rented the first one, watched that, and then went and saw the second one in the theater. And I think I ended up seeing the second one in the theater another time within the first week or so after it came out. And then leading up to the release of Part 3, the Alamo Drafthouse here in Austin played all three back to back the Thursday that before it opened. And so the way that you and I got hooked up initially stemmed from a conversation that started on Facebook with Dane. He saw that I had checked in and was seeing the triple feature, and he started making some kind of downplaying comments like he wasn't interested. And at one point I was just like, dude, that is your loss. And so when you started that conversation on Twitter, he was like, you guys need to talk. So I was lucky enough, thanks to a friend who was wiser than I, to get to see the first one in theaters when it came out. And since then, every time a new one has been announced, I've been right there opening weekend.
I didn't even see, for my side, I didn't even see it in theaters. I think it was on DVD, actually. I don't even remember how I ended up watching it. I guess I just heard good things and I Redboxed it or something and finally checked it out, because people might not, people need to remember, prior to John Wick, Keanu Reeves was on a little bit of a downturn. He had just come off of 47 Ronin, which was a big budget flop. His last big studio movie was The Day the Earth Stood Still, like 6 years earlier, which did not do really well and was kind of critically derided. So it had been a while since he had been a big thing. So this really felt like one of the big sleeper hits of the fall of 2014. So I somehow got involved with it when it came to DVD. I bought a copy of it on DVD, and then when Chapter 2 came out, my dad and my brother and I went to see it. And that's a tradition that we now kept up with Chapter 3. And then after that ended, I was like, all right, fellas, I'll see you a couple years for Chapter 4. Before I knew that before it was announced that it was going to come out almost exactly 2 years later. Yes. Because I just assumed that, the way the third one ends that's not really a spoiler for the third one, that it's going to continue. They already announced that film. So yeah, it's something that I really fell in love with over time. And it's funny because it did well, but it didn't do like gangbusters at the box office. It cost $20, it made $43 domestically, but the sequels, like the third one, outgrossed the first one in its opening weekend. It's insane how quickly the audience has grown over each film. I think it's 43, 92, and then we're at like 100 and something now for the third one, and it's only been out, I think, 2 weeks.
Yeah, that's impressive. And I think that just goes to show the positive word of mouth, because I think that there were a lot of people who maybe didn't catch the first one or even the second one in the theaters. Yeah. But from having that experience of friends saying, you've got to see this movie, you've got to watch this movie, it just continues to grow. Actually, I went and rewatched Chapter 3 this morning with my daughter and her fiance. And that kind of came out of nowhere. We were talking earlier this week, and I asked if they had seen it, and my daughter told me that they hadn't seen the first two either. And I went digging around in my Blu-ray collection and still had the digital download codes stuck in the front of Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. So I took a picture of those, sent them over, and I was like, just be aware there's maybe 30-second sequence in the first one that you're probably going to want to look away for. But they watched the first one and fell in love with it. The next night, watched the second one. And so this morning we got up at and went to like a 10:30 showing and watched the third one.
It feels like the very definition of a franchise that came completely out of nowhere, because it featured basically at the time, kind of washed up action star, and directed by his former stunt double, and the screenwriter Derek Kolstad. He only really previously done, because I looked him up right before this, he'd only really previously written a couple of direct to DVD Dolph Lundgren films, so there was not really much pedigree like behind the scenes to for this to become what it has become, which it's crazy how it just feels like it's grown very organically over time.
Absolutely. I think this is a case of having the right people with the right project at the right time and everybody giving it their best effort.
Which is ironic, considering that the beginning of the movie, the kind of inciting incident, is kind of a classic example of a wrong person being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I think you're referring to the death of the puppy early on. Yes. And I think that turned off like some of my family members, my parents, my mom is a dog person and all that. So my brother, same thing. So I think that really made them be like, oh wait, I don't want to see a puppy get killed. I think that was the kind of initially a little bit of a turnoff. And I'd be like, okay, well, skip that part, fast forward the 30-second, like that one scene, and then you're good to go from there on out. So it really also feels to me like it's kind of almost because of the thing with the puppy, it feels like it's born out of kind of I guess we should say the general premise of the movie, but it basically starts out like as a home invasion film that, and that's kind of goes into the elements of horror that I was talking about. That it feels like kind of a B-movie premise. This guy who's out with his wife died. He has a puppy, and guys break in his house, take his car, kill his puppy, and that's it. He's got to get revenge on his puppy. So from the outset, it feels almost like a B-movie, like kind of goofy, like cult movie. But it actually, what makes it different, what makes this film work, I think, and has carried the character forward, is that there is that there's genuine emotion behind it. Like there's a deeper meaning. He says in chapter 3, it wasn't just a puppy. There was a lot more to that character, and I think it's kind of taken time for maybe audiences to realize that.
I agree with that 100%. And like you're saying, I think this does have a lot in common with specifically some grindhouse and exploitation style films from the 70s. And maybe the early 80s as well. But it's on a bigger scale. It's got A-list actors. It's got, top-notch action sequences. So I almost am loath to use the term again, but it's kind of elevated from these kind of humble, low-budget roots.
And especially now with the sequels, the first one is very straightforward. It's very contained. It almost feels like in some way, kind of a proof of concept for what they could do with this world, with this character, because it's all set in New York. And then in the sequels, he goes international, and you can tell that they had a exponentially bigger budget to get bigger stars into it and all of that. And I think that's really kind of helped, I guess, expand the appeal of the franchise. So we can't really talk about the John Wick franchise without talking about Keanu Reeves. So what did you think about his performance in this movie and where he was in his career? First of all, what do you think about Keanu Reeves as an actor? Do you think he is a, quote, good actor?
I think that there are roles where he has been absolutely perfect for, and then I think there have been instances where he has been woefully miscast. Mm-hmm. You take a look at early on, most of our first exposure to him was probably in the Bill and Ted movies.
Absolutely.
He's perfect in that role. Then I think back to the mid-90s when I was working in a movie theater and Bram Stoker's Dracula came out. And so much of that movie is just gorgeous and painstakingly put together. And his accent in that movie just completely takes me out of it every time. But then you flash forward a few years to The Matrix, and The Matrix to me, kind of redefined what he could do in a movie and what he was willing to do in a movie. And especially in the beginning of that trilogy, his character played off of some of the stereotypes and jokes that existed about who he was. And I think what we see with the John Wick series is almost exactly what we saw with The Matrix. You know, it was taking him from a place where his career may not have been in the best place, and tailoring a movie to all of his strengths. And I think one of his greatest strengths is his willingness to put in so much work to physically prepare for these kinds of roles. So you're right. I mean, you take a look at things like The Day the Earth Stood Still and 47 Ronin, and he was kind of on the downward slope of the career trajectory. But I think with this series, and especially how much it has continued to grow, it's put him back on top again. I was speaking with someone recently, and it may have been Dane when Dane was kind of poo-pooing the John Wick movies, but I said, and there may be some that I'm missing because I'm not the biggest action fan, but to me, these are probably the best American action movies made in the last 20 years or so.
Well, I definitely want to comment on that, but to back it up a second. But yeah, I know I 100% agree with you on Keanu Reeves. I'm a big fan of the Bill and Ted movies. I grew up with those. The Matrix and Speed. Like if you put him in the right mode where he gets to like either quietly, like has like either a quiet strength or sort of takes advantage of his kind of in it, because he has an inherent likability on screen. So even something like John Wick, that character gets sort of moments of like kind of wry, like dark humor infused within the plot line of everything that's going on with all the violence and everything surrounding him. But he's great at being angry. He's great at kind of coming off as like a broken man, because that's I don't know how much you know about like Keanu Reeves' real life, but he's suffered a lot of tragedy. He had a girlfriend or fiance, I think, that passed away when she was pregnant with his child, and there's a lot of, and I think I remember he was in that movie Hardball in the early 2000s, and I think I remember like him even like saying that he channeled some of that actual grief that he experienced into that performance, which gets kind of dark towards the end. He seems like he brings a lot of gravitas to this role specifically, and I don't think he necessarily could have done this part if he were 30, if he were 40. But the fact that he's a 54-year-old man who has been in this industry, just crazy to see a 54. I mean, I'm 35, and he looks better, younger, in better shape than I ever been, probably will ever be. And like you said, he's just so physically committed to the part, to learning the stunt work as much as to let him, I guess. And this actually ties back into your other point. It really reminds me of Tom Cruise in the Mission Impossible movies. I mean, it's a very different style of action. But to me, those two are the only ones that come into my mind when I think of the best American action movie franchises right now. I mean, I love things like The Raid, which is, again, like that's Indonesian. That's not, the North American whatsoever. But as far as the American side of things, I think John Wick and Mission Impossible are head and shoulders above everything else. And that includes the billion-dollar Fast and Furious movies, which are very hit and miss these days. Kind of have been, I guess. But yeah, and it comes down to Reeves, his commitment to the role, the fact that they have the same director, the same screenwriter. It feels like there's one vision running through these films. And that's something I think that Mission Impossible specifically has kind of struggled with, bringing in a different director. And now they're really hitting their stride with Christopher McQuarrie, who did 5 and 6, and now is doing 7 and 8. But just the fact that those two franchises keep pushing the envelope. Mission Impossible with, as far as the crazy stunts, hanging on planes and things like that. And John Wick as far as gunplay, knife play, car chases. And their leading men are both in their mid-50s. I think that's kind of an interesting comparison. What else would you put in that conversation? What are like the runner-ups, I guess, to the John Wick? Is Mission Impossible in there for you at all?
Yes, I would say that Mission Impossible would be a second place for me, just because I have not found that series to be either as consistent or as engaging as the John Wick films. And I think your point about having that continuity of the creative team contributes so much to that. But honestly, if we're looking at anything that could even be comparable, I think you have to start looking outside the U.S. Films like there's a Korean action film that came out a couple of years ago called The Villainous, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but it seems like The Villainous got a nod in John Wick 3 with the motorcycle sword fight.
Oh, nice.
And then there was a movie by I may butcher his name, Timo Jahanto, I believe is his name, called The Night Comes for Us, which is on Netflix right now. That is similar in a lot of ways to The Raid, but just has mind-boggling action. There may be things from the U.S. that I have let slip by or have flown under my radar, but I don't think there's anything really going on that holds a candle to John Wick or to Mission Impossible. And I think you've already touched on one of the big reasons why. And I think another thing that adds to that is that, of course, those movies integrate CGI into what they're doing, but so much of the stunt work is practical, and that shows in the finished product.
Absolutely. I think part of it too is that some of it all feels really personal. We're getting everything pretty much from John Wick's perspective. Everything is a lot of times it tends to be really close combat, whether it's with weapons or without weapons. Everything feels really there's a certain intimacy and visceral nature to the action in this film. Because they're not, to go back, not to pick on Fast and Furious, but it's an easy target. They're not flying cars off of rooftops or having what was in the last one, the wave of remote control cars chasing down the streets or whatever was going on there. It's that just takes you out of it. Or the Transformers is another one that it's an easier target than even Fast and Furious. But there's such high level and attention to detail with every little bit of the action in these films. And you can tell that they're getting only better at it with each movie, because the third one, I feel like there were usually 3 action sequences kind of strung together, where you get a knife fight and then you go right into a motorcycle chase and then right into a foot chase or a gunfight or whatever. It's just so relentless to the point that by the end of the movie, I was exhausted watching him, have to deal with everything that was coming at him, because it takes a while. And to go back to the first movie, which is ostensibly the focus here, the first act really there isn't really any action for maybe 30 minutes, something like that, because they are laying the groundwork for what he's been through, what he's feeling inside, the fact that he feels like he has nothing to lose. And they hook you. It kind of reminds me of how Guardians of the Galaxy does that a little in the first scene. They hook you with the emotion up front, and then everything that happens afterwards, the action actually means something. There's a story behind it rather than just, oh, look how they fight really cool, And that elevates it. So you're connected to this man and you're invested in what happens to him.
Yes. And I think there's 2 things going on there. You mentioned Keanu Reeves' likability, and I couldn't agree more with that statement. If this were a lesser actor or a less likable actor, I don't think that audiences would connect with the character of John Wick the way that they do, because if you take away the likability and some of what is set up in that first sequence of the first film, he's not a very redeemable character. He's not a very nice character. He is, it's hard to even call him an anti-hero. He's probably one of the least bad of the bad guys that the movie's world is populated with. But because Keanu brings that likability to the role, and because we see what he has gone through with the loss of his wife and trying to get out of the life so that he could be there with this woman that it sounds like in many ways saved him, and then to have all of that ripped away and have any reminders of her that he was trying to hold on to systematically taken away from him, we really start to empathize with the character. We start to want to see him pull off these impossible tasks and survive another day. Even though if you look at things from just a black and white vantage point, he's a bad guy, and we shouldn't be rooting for him.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it helps. You know, I mentioned earlier that he wouldn't have been able to pull this role off in his 30s or 40s, and I think it you know, we're already inherently on his side because we've seen him in other movies. We've seen his career go up and down. So he feels like an underdog in a way, even though he's obviously not, because the movie does such an focused job of mythologizing him way like before you even see him like smash through his little arsenal there and let everything loose. The whole Baba Yaga speech, basically, that Michael Nyqvist did. So what do you think about that part of it? You know, speaking to the fact that this is head and shoulders above pretty much every other action franchise, how much of that do you think is owed to the world building, the coins, the markers, the rules of the Continental, the high table, the Baba Yaga thing, the impossible task, the whole with a fucking pencil, the three guys with all of that, the sommelier and all that. Like, how much do you think? Because I feel like that is kind of the franchise's signature in a way.
It is a huge part of it. And it's one of the things that I love about every sequel that we get. Every sequel kind of pulls the curtain back a little bit more. We learn more about the world and how it works and how these characters interact. And as that's going on, the palette that they're painting with gets bigger, both in terms of the locations and the look of the film as well. Moving forward to chapter 3, one of the most stunning sequences to me was the time spent in and around Casablanca, where they completely changed the look of the film and the color palettes used. It was stunning. And jumping back a minute to the sommelier, that is one of my favorite parts of chapter 2. That actor, Peter Serafinowicz, I am familiar with from a number of British comedies that I got into back in like the early 2000s. And so to see him in that role, it just makes me smile every time. And about that same time, they also have him interacting with the tailor when he's getting outfitted for the bulletproof suit.
Yep.
The person playing the role of the tailor is actually the costume designer for all of the films. Nice. He had never acted before, but they couldn't find someone that they wanted for that role, and so they just brought him in and had him do it.
That's kind of actually a wonderful little like meta casting, because you just, go on camera, talk about the suit like it's a suit, and we'll all infer that you're talking about, fortifying and making it basically armor. That's the other thing these movies do so perfectly. I feel like the first one is a little more straight. It's a little like, it's more, like I said, it's more of a proof of concept of them being like, okay, will people buy into this, where there's this whole like underbelly of assassins, and then people were, right, gradually got it. Like, oh, okay, this is cool, I get it. Then the second one and the third one, even more so, they really toy with that, where they really try and see how far can we push this? How close, how much can we toe the line between really really grounded action thriller and like kind of ridiculous, almost comic book level, out of loss here, a world building of mythologized. I keep going back to those words because that's what it feels like. It's like, oh, there's the secret society behind it all. And, yes, it feels very comic booky in a way. And the fact that they have all these character actors that pop up. I mean, obviously Halle Berry is not a character actress, but you have people like Willem Dafoe and John Leguizamo and Ian McShane and, you mentioned Peter Serafinowicz and Lance Reddick and Ruby Rose, Common, Peter Stormare, all these people, Mark Dacascos, Angelica Houston, that show up in there. It feels like this franchise is almost a haven for character actors in the way that the Continental is for assassins. And you have them playing at all these different levels, where Ian McShane is kind of playful, Lawrence Fishburne gets to really ham it up, and it gives you such a huge sandbox to play in, where you never know if you're going to have a tragic moment or something kind of goofy happen.
or a mix of the two.
Usually yeah.
So another one of the cameos that really made me sit up and take notice in the second one, the manager of the Continental in Rome is Franco Nero, who most people if they recognize him from spaghetti westerns. And he also had a bit part in Django Unchained, which was, a bit of a tongue-in-cheek thing because he played Django in a spaghetti western of the same name. But you also mentioned that these feel like a comic book. And I think that's a really important point, because if you hear the director talk about the approach to the films, one thing that he mentions over and over and over again is how he kind of thinks of this in terms of a graphic novel. And his approach to the storytelling and even some of the visuals is inspired by graphic novels. And so I think that there is a definite element of that we have to keep in mind. I've heard some people kind of wringing their hands about the violence or the quote unquote gun porn used in John Wick. And it's important for us to remember that this is not meant to be the real world. There is enough world building going on and enough similarity with the world we live in today to where some of it feels real. But yes, this is mythology. This is storytelling. This is a made up world, even though parts of it feel like our own.
I mean, it's just so. And then again, this is the thing, the sequels have really highlighted. It's just so operatic. The second one, you have the whole scene. There's like a concert going on when he takes a trip to Italy. In the third one, there's like ballet rehearsal happening while the shootout is going on. And you can, even little things like when he goes to the tailor and gets his, like, that's his bat suit, basically. He's getting outfitted with all the little toys. He's got super villains. There's a secret. There's like literally a Legion of Doom kind of running everything. I mean, it's so stylized from everything. And you mentioned the visuals, the way that the sequels really play with like neon light and all kinds of color blends, and the cinematography, the sound design, even the Tyler Bates and Joel J. Richards score. It's very it feels like something out of a Blade movie, really.
Yes. And it also includes new takes on the themes that follow along with the movies as well. In the second one, I thought that I noticed more overt cues that seemed they wouldn't be out of place in a spaghetti western. And then in the third one, it incorporates more Middle Eastern sounds, especially during the sequences where they're in and around Casablanca. That is just as rich a part of the storytelling as any of the world building or on-screen action that takes place. And again, having the same composers working on each one ties them all together thematically, just like everything else we've been talking about.
Yeah, and if this franchise is influenced by horror, then John Wick is literally the boogeyman. He's basically, if you flip the perspective, if you tell the story from Alfie Allen's perspective in the first movie, John Wick is like Freddy Krueger coming after everyone else.
If you flip that perspective, you could very easily see John Wick as a Michael Myers character, but with a gun instead of a butcher knife. He's not going to say very much to you. He is just an unstoppable force. And from that aspect, it very much plays like a horror film.
And he doesn't really have, if you really go back and look at the films, he doesn't really have that much dialogue. He's very much a classical action hero that he only speaks when he needs to. He doesn't really quip. He has, he's very short. That's why be seeing you is kind of his all-purpose response to anyone that says, I'm going to get you, John, or whatever, throughout the trilogy. It's not even really a trilogy. They're going to do more. So is there a specific, I guess, talking about the first film, is there a specific action sequence or moment or something in the first film that really stands out to you?
If I was to nail it down to one, I think you have to go with the ultimate fight after he's taken out Alfie Allen's character and Vigo is trying to get to the helicopter and get away before the boogeyman can get to him. So you start out with this car chase where there's just they're running SUVs off the side of this huge drop off, but it ends almost like a classic gunfight, or even a face-off between Neo and the agent in the Matrix, where it's all just this torrential downpour and this balls out fist fight between John Wick and Vigo. That is just, it just is like the ultimate visuals from that movie for me. If I think about John Wick 1, that's what I think about, is that fist fight out in the rain. Even though they aren't doing the fancy gun work or anything like that for much of it, there is the part where Dean Winters hops out of the car and is shooting John Wick, and John Wick ends up taking him out with the car.
These movies have such a forward momentum to them. That's why, like, for me to go back and try and pick out a favorite action beat or sequence, it's almost really hard for me to do so, because it just feels like, especially the sequels, it feels like such a consistent flow. It's not like I mention these a lot, but just because they're everywhere these days, like, it's not like a Marvel movie where there's basically 3 set pieces, beginning, middle, end. It's just there's different scale to them, but they're so consistently doled out. And we said right before we started recording that part of why these films feel so cohesive is, yes, the team behind it, but the fact that between 1 and 2, I think there's maybe a few days for Aurelio to locate the car, and then for 2 and 3, 10 minutes, it picks up right from the end. So that's why I'm really jealous that you got to see all 3 of them in a back-to-back marathon on the big screen, because it just must have just felt like one 6-hour movie, basically.
That's exactly what it felt like. And we also mentioned episodic television. And I think another reason that it gets to be kind of hard to just pick out one specific scene or one specific beat is that if you do watch them in close succession like that, it all becomes one big movie. Mm-hmm. I mean, when I think back about it, especially being able to watch them all 3 back to back a couple of weeks ago, that's what it feels like. It feels like, you may get an intermission and a chance to run to the restroom, but that's the equivalent of a commercial break. You're back in your seat and the action's picking up right away.
Do you, having seen all 3 films, like literally back right next to each other, do you have a favorite from the 3, or is that really hard to parse out at this point?
I go back and forth. If I were to look at my Letterboxd ratings, I believe that I have the first rated as 4.5 out of 5 stars, and then the second and the third rated as 4 stars. But I don't know that is. I don't know that that's indicative of a difference in quality between any of them. I think that the first one just stuck with me because it was so different from anything that I had seen up to that point, and it was, easily the best thing that I had seen Keanu Reeves in since the first Matrix movie. Mm-hmm. But it's really hard for me to pick out a favorite. I mean, when Chapter 2 came out, I was just blown away by the action sequences in that, especially like you mentioned around the concert and when he's going through the catacombs trying to get away. Those action sequences are amazing. And then there's the whole optical illusion fight at the end. But then seeing 3 just ups the ante even more. And I love the sequence when when he is fighting with Halle Berry by his side and her dogs. That is just incredible. And the third one also brings in, several different types of enemies that we hadn't seen John confront before. You have you have the Japanese fighters that are almost fighting like ninjas and hiding in the background and jumping out and just taking people down brutally with swords. It's hard for me to say that I like one out of the other. I would be willing to sit and watch all 3 back to back again, and I don't know that I could pick a favorite.
Yeah, no, to your point, I think it's the rare franchise where every time they make another one, it's so good and it as we said already, deepens the world. And actually, you learn a little bit more about John, which everyone too. Like in the second one, you learn how he actually managed to get out. That he needed Santino's help to do so. In the third one, you learn a little bit about his background, where he grew up, like that he actually had ties with Angelica Houston. When he was much younger, like coming up as an orphan and things like that. Like you see little bits, like you learn about the High Table, but you also learn about his own history, and it sort of feels like because of that, each subsequent film, because they've been hitting that mark so consistently, actually elevates, not to use that word again, but in a different context, actually elevates the other films. You know what I mean? So watching 2 and 3 actually adds dimension to 1. So they're all kind of, for me, they're all kind of floating in the 4.5 realm. And other than Mission Impossible, I can't think of another action franchise that you're that captivated to see. I mean, you're a horror guy, and I'm not as well versed in that, but I kept going back every year for those damn Saw movies, not because they were great, but because they tease answers to questions, and then it's like a soap opera with like mutilations every 10 minutes. That because they tease out answers of like, oh, what's behind that door? Where did she bring that letter? Or like, what, how did this work with this apprentice or whatever? And because of that, it's like you're so keyed into it that chapter 2 ended, and I mentioned that I saw them with my dad and my brother, the second and third, and I leaned over and like, I want the third one right now. We were both like all like hyped up for it, and 3 leaves you the same way. So it almost makes me wonder, like, where do you think the next film will go? How many of these should they make before they just stop risking the whole franchise?
Well, that's a good point. And, something to think about is ultimately one of two things is going to happen. It's all going to catch up with John Wick, and he won't be smart enough or fast enough or skilled enough to get out of it, or they will run the risk of the series becoming a parody of itself. Because I mean, John Wick as it is, he's not invincible, but
kind of is.
He's pretty close to it, but we are willing to stretch the suspension of disbelief because we are so invested in the character and in the world. But I believe, just on a personal level, that as long as the creative team has a vision and Keanu continues to put in the work to make these set pieces believable, they've still got a lot of gas in the tank. I would love to see John Wick 4, 5, and 6.
As long as he's up for it, like I mentioned, he is 54, so it's like if he's gonna stay as committed physically to this role, you kind of imagine that at some point it's not gonna be healthy for him to continue to do so, which is why I think, going back to Mission Impossible, which is why I think they're doing 7 and 8 back to back, because he's actually even older than Keanu Reeves by a couple years. So they're trying to get as many of those in the tank as they can before like his back goes out or something, and it's like, forget it. The doctors don't sign off on it anymore. Do you have a particular like wish or idea or something you want them to? I mean, obviously, it looks like. I mean, not really, kind of mild spoilers for chapter 4 or for chapter 3, and then I guess speculation for chapter 4. But it looks like we're finally going to at least get closer to meeting the High Table. But see, I kind of felt like that was going to be 3, like that we were going to get there in 3. And I feel like they're just extending that road a little bit more, probably because they don't know what their grand plan is for this franchise.
Well, we did meet some of the High Table in 3.
That's true.
So we did meet the gentleman in Casablanca that was played by the actor who many people will know from Game of Thrones as Sir Bronn of the Blackwater. So we met him, and he was in charge of the minting operation where they created the gold coins and the markers.
Which was so cool to see that, too. Just the little details. You're like, oh, that's where that comes from. It's like everything's starting to fall into place.
And then we meet the man out in the desert who, at least as far as we know, is the leader of the High Table. And, a big part of Chapter 3 has to do with this sect of people that we've never been introduced to previously, the adjudicators. So just like in 2, we are getting a wider shot of the world. We're learning more about the mythology, but there's still plenty that we don't know. So, and this may get into spoiler territory as well, but I won't say too much. I will say that with the way that it ended, I was having a conversation with my family earlier today, and we really want to believe that the events that happen with Winston towards the end are part of a long con and not actually a big turn in his character.
Yeah, I think that as well. I mean, they've spent too much time building up that relationship, because the relationship between John and Winston is really kind of the most, I guess, the most focal relationship for John, other than his relationship with his wife in these movies. I mean, they really highlight that in every single movie, that he cuts John a lot of slack. He gave him that hour, which comes back to bite him in this movie. Spoilers, I guess. And so I have to believe that he is still kind of, I don't want to say too much about it, that there's a lot more that we don't know about that scenario and how John and Winston, where they are going to end up in Volume 4. I've tweeted about this in the last few days as well, but I really kind of want to see, now that Lawrence Fishburne has been in these movies, I really want to see Carrie-Anne Moss. And even leaving the movie, I was joking to my brother, because we've talked, he and I, like, both of our favorite movies, basically The Matrix, and we've talked about that on this podcast a few months ago. So I was leaning over to him, like, half joking, half serious, like, how awesome would it be if they get Hugo Weaving to show up in these things as, like, the big bad in one of these movies? And he's like Mr. Wick or something like that. Like, it feels like in a way the John Wick series is evolving into the Matrix franchise, which, if it does that kind of, like, if it toys with that a little bit, I can get down with that. I mean, just with the fact that they brought Lawrence Fishburne in it, and the way, not mild spoilers, now the way Chapter 3 kind of teases at them playing up more of that, that character in some way. What do you think about that? Like, who would you like to see join the ensemble next? Not that we want this to turn into the Expendables or something, but
I would be down to see either Hugo Weaving or Carrie-Anne Moss. And one thing that I was thinking as I was watching it today was the character of the adjudicator, who I believe the actress's name is Asia Kate Dillon. I'm not familiar with any of her other work, but there were moments in John Wick 3 where her character was very reminiscent to me of Carrie-Anne Moss, and so I could easily see them finding a place for her in that world.
Yeah, I've actually heard that as well. That maybe they were kind of eyeing Carrie-Anne Moss for that role. I don't know if that's speculative, because that's people like us watching the movie and be like, she could have done that, or if there was actually somebody behind the films, said that, or Carrie-Anne Moss said that she was offered the role or something like that. But yeah, she does have a certain sort of detached, kind of cold, androgynous energy that Asia Kate Dillon also brought to the role, and I love that character. So I definitely want to learn more about the Adjudicator going into 4. The other thing that they've mentioned for the John Wick franchise, this was actually a couple years ago after 2, so I don't know if it's still happening or not, is the TV series centered on the Continental. What do you think about the idea of, who knows, like a Hulu or Amazon Prime or something series picking up and exploring that, focusing more on the world itself, separate from John Wick?
So I'm of two minds on that. If it was given the proper creative team and the proper budget, and just approached smaller stories, it could be good. But I think the danger there is that you're not going to be able to have the cast, you're not going to be able to have the set pieces, and most likely you're not going to be able to have a continual creative team. And so I don't think that it would feel as cohesive a world as what we're used to. Mm-hmm. I think in theory it would be great, and I would love to see, the stories that are going on behind the different doors in the Continental, or visit different Continentals that we haven't yet seen. We've seen Casablanca, we've seen Rome, we've seen New York, but I'm sure there are plenty more out there. But I think that would be a gamble. And what I would hate to do is to see viewer sentiment turn against John Wick because they tried a series, be it on television or a streaming service, and it just didn't gel.
It feels like an idea to me that they were floating out there after the second movie, and maybe they recognizing that it would be risking the viability of the films, and maybe they'll keep that in their back pocket for after the movies have sort of run their course. Right. Because it would at least, you have to imagine that some of the supporting, depending when they said it, you have to imagine some of the supporting players. Lance Reddick would show up either as a recurring character or something. Right. Possibly even Ian McShane could be in it, depending, all these, because we've met so many assassins and people in this world over these three movies that there's lots of opportunity for cameos to pop up there. And we were talking about the John Wick Matrix connections a minute ago, and I wanted to make sure I mentioned that Randall Duck Kim, the doctor that's sewing him up early in 3, is actually the key maker from The Matrix Reloaded. So that's another Matrix John Wick connection.
Oh, that's awesome. I had not caught that.
Yeah, I think I remembered when he was cast, and when I saw him, I was like, is that the guy from The Matrix? I was like, oh my God, that's right. They did add him to the cast. So I think that's the other reason why why it feels like they're really leaning into like Keanu's speed dialing everybody that was in The Matrix and being like, hey, do you want to be a part of the John Wick franchise? Joey Pants, come on. We can play, somebody that works at the Continental or whatever.
It's funny. It's funny that you mentioned that. So as I was preparing for our talk today, I went through and was watching the films with the director commentary for 1 and 2, and they told a story about how Lawrence Fishburne got involved, and Keanu said that they've kept their friendship since they worked on The Matrix, and they get together periodically and hang out. And they had gotten together at one point after the first John Wick had come out, and Lawrence Fishburne told him how much he really liked the movie. And Keanu was surprised and pleased, and went back and told the director, Chad Stahelski, that Lawrence Fishburne had really liked the movie. And the director was like, really? And so they sent him an email or a copy of the script or something to see if he would be interested in playing a role. And the message that they got back just said something along the lines of, I'm in, and it was signed Fish. So it was just like 2 words in the email and half a signature, and he was in the world. So I would imagine that they could get some other people from those movies involved. They spent so much time working on those movies together that I have to imagine that they have a number of strong relationships built.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, The Matrix is my favorite movie. It was the film that. And if you listeners want to hear more, they can hear me and my brother talk about this for 2.5 hours. It went on for a while. But it's the movie that really helped me make the transition from, movies are fun, it's escapism, it's entertainment, to, oh my God, there's an art behind this. Everything has an intentionality. Everything is purposeful. There's symbolism, there's themes, and all these. It's the movie that really opened me up to the artistic side of cinema. So that's kind of just my connection to The Matrix. So anything that John Wick wants to do, they'll throw a little reference to that. All about it. I'm all about it. And I like the fact that now Keanu is a huge star again, and he's got a third franchise, if you count Bill and Ted. Now he's going back, supposedly this fall, I think, to shoot the third Bill and Ted movie, which is, it's insane that we live in this world now where everything from the 90s, everything that I grew up with, that we grew up with, is coming out like now. Everything's being refreshed. It's right. Did you have any other, I think we're kind of winding down because now I'm talking about Bill and Ted, but do you have any other thoughts on John Wick itself? Like where you want, either about the movie, the first one, the sequels, speculation for 4, or anything else you wanted to mention before we start winding down?
Well, I did have a couple of thoughts. One of those has to do with the question that you asked about, a potential television series or something like that. And thinking along those lines, I can't help but think of this, and not to get too far off topic, but there was a movie that came out between John Wick 2 and John Wick 3 that was called Hotel Artemis, that had Jodie Foster in it. And I knew people that swore up and down that this was a John Wick movie that was all about, another hotel like the Continental. And it's absolutely not connected, but it is absolutely someone else's take on a very similar mythology. And I just didn't care for it. I don't know if you've seen it. I would say it's worth watching once, especially if you don't have to pay for it. But it really stands in stark distinction of showing what the right team can do versus not having a right team.
I heard mixed to negative things on it. I think I was initially curious, and then I heard that it's like, I was not impressed by the reception I was hearing. So I was like, I could probably not watch that or see it eventually. And it's just, I haven't gotten to it. I mean, but we have 3 John Wick movies now. So if I want to see that premise done right, I'll watch John Wick 1, 2, 3.
Exactly. It's more of a curiosity. I think I found it on sale for like $6 or $7, and so I figured, I'll spend $6 or $7. And I watched it. I didn't hate it, but it was disappointing. Now, something else that's interesting that I don't know how I feel about it, but it seems a little bit more to the good side of things, is there has been talk or rumors or speculation about a potential of crossing over the worlds of John Wick and Atomic Blonde.
Yeah.
And I could see that working much more, much better than what whoever tried to do with Hotel Artemis, just because you've got some of the same creative team working on both. They feel very similar in a lot of ways. And I was blown away by Atomic Blonde as well.
No, I completely agree. I remember seeing some speculative articles like when Atomic Blonde was coming out, and hearing stories of Charlize Theron and Keanu Reeves, who worked together on Devil's Advocate and Sweet November, that they were like working out at the same place around the same time for the 2 movies, and the aesthetic's very similar. It's directed by David Leitch, who uncredited co-directed the first John Wick, so it almost feels like at some point having those 2 worlds collide makes perfect sense, because you have 2 stars that are already friendly. The 2 directors who started the John Wick franchise initially. So how cool would it be if Atomic Blonde and John Wick bring back together the initial team that created John Wick in the first place? I would be 100% into that. And that's a great movie too. That's a good call. As far as Hotel Artemis, I'm all about watching curiosities. I just told you I spent 85 minutes of my life watching another Wolf Cop recently. So clearly there's a low bar sometimes for me to be like, you know what? Fuck it. Let's see what happens. But Atomic Blonde is actually a movie I would recommend. And I feel like a lot of people slept on it for some reason or another. I think it came out like the tail end of the summer a couple of years back. So that probably didn't help. Probably a lot of competition at the box office, but yeah, that's definitely one that people that are fans of the John Wick franchise should check out.
I agree 100% on that. And that was another film that I asked my daughter and her fiance today if they had seen it, and they both said no. And so I went and snapped a picture of the digital download code from the Blu-ray and sent it over to them. So there may be another couple of converts on that movie soon too.
There you go. I love it. I love that you're paying it forward. So I think usually I don't kind of like pitch movies so hard, but like if people listening to this, you haven't seen John Wick Chapter 3 Parabellum, it's now playing. It's because usually we talk about movies that are out on Blu-ray and DVD or whatever already. But if people listening to this are curious about John Wick and haven't seen any of them or the new one, go find somebody that'll send you the digital codes for the first 2 and then go see 3 in theaters while it's still there, because I highly recommend that people that are interested in it seeing it on a big screen with Dolby sound or an IMAX screen or whatever before Aladdin and all the other Disney movies that are coming out in the next few weeks take over every screen at your local Cineplex. So John, can you tell people where they can find you on social media?
Absolutely. You can find me on Twitter at The Horror Aisle.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on. As you can tell, we're similarly passionate about this franchise. So I don't know. Has Dane not seen them? Like, is he not into them because he's not interested in seeing them, or did he see them and doesn't care for it?
From what I got from him, he has not watched them, and he was not interested in doing so. Honestly, that kind of the way that I felt about The Matrix 20 years ago, right. And I was wrong. I was so wrong, and it took a couple of friends whose taste I trusted saying, "Go see this movie," to get me over that. So maybe between you and me, we can get him to watch John Wick.
Well, it's also, as we mentioned, like the John Wick, the roots of it feel very B-movie. And he has a podcast about cult films. So right. It feels like somebody, either his co-host on that show or us, somebody needs to like strap him down Clockwork Orange style and hold his eyes open and like, dude, give it I don't know if maybe he's a dog person and he's like, oh, turned off by the puppy thing at the beginning, which obviously is not fun to watch. It's an upsetting moment, but it's a one scene out of the whole, and it fuels the rest of the movie. So.
Well, and I will say about that, because I've had this conversation with my sister recently, who is convalescing from an ankle injury and looking for recommendations of things to watch. And I said, you want to be aware there is a scene of violence that involves a dog, but it's like 30 seconds out of a 2-hour movie, and it's one of the inciting incidents for the story. But realistically, the way that is handled, it's not graphic, it's not exploitative, but it's still going to get you where it hurts. Mm-hmm. But it's primarily done with the sound design and the blurry lens effect, and then you see the after effect. And so it's not exploitative, it's not graphic and in your face, but it's there and it does hurt.
Yeah. I think it's the shot afterwards where he's holding Daisy. Yes. After that, yeah. After they've left and everything. And it's funny because this is a really hard R action thriller franchise, like we said, very comic booky, and yet between the fact that the whole first movie is in part fueled by avenging a puppy, and then there's he finds a dog at the end of the first one that then carries over into the second film, then all the stuff with Halle Berry's dogs in the third movie. Dog people, this is the franchise for you. Forget about all that other stuff. I just think that's kind of funny how they weave that throughout that.
Well, and there are 2 lines of dialogue in chapter 3 that completely cracked me up. There's an instance where Mark Dacascos' character is trying to converse with John Wick and say that they're similar in a lot of ways, and he gets, "I'm a cat person myself." And then there's a line where he's talking with Halle Berry about her dogs, and he just says in response to something that's happened, "No, I get it."
Yeah, I've been there.
But yeah, both of those lines just get a laugh out of me every time.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. John, this has been an absolute pleasure. You're definitely welcome to come back to the show anytime, horror or otherwise. If you see something and you're like, that would be a good something for me to talk to Rob about on the Crooked Table podcast, send me an email or a tweet or whatever, and we'll definitely have to connect at some point. This was so much fun delving into the world of John Wick as it stands.
I agree, Rob. I love the movies. I had a great time talking about them with you here tonight, and I'll look forward to the chance that we have again in the future.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John. Appreciate it.
If you're interested in joining me on the show to chat about one of your favorite films, head on over to crookedtable.com/guest. Or you can consider supporting the show at patreon.com/crookedtable. Of course, you can always find more podcasts, reviews, videos, and other movie-related goodies over at crookedtable.com. Until next time, this has been the Crooked Table Podcast, and I've been Rob.
This has been a production of crookedtable.com. All rights reserved.
CROOKED.